Hello students, welcome back to this online session on the Scarlet letter. This is the second module wherein we'll be introducing the text to you. Now before we venture into the story, the plot, summary, its analysis, it is important to understand that why is this text so important? Why do we say that it is a classical text, or what is the importance of this text throughout the ages that we're still reading it in the 21st century? Now there are a couple of parameters on which we can decide the text as a classic in itself. First, of course, is the originality. Now if you've read the text, you would realize that in terms of the story and the plot, there is not a lot of action that takes place in the novel. Yet, the theme that Hawthorne deals with in itself is originally the most uncommon theme of that time. It was a theme which you would not see in any other novel or any other works of that time. It is not just a theme which is of importance, but the way it has been treated by the author in the novel is of importance, and it is something that cannot be copied in the past, or it cannot be copied even in the future. The treatment brings about so many critical perspectives around adultery and the punishment that Hester Prynne goes through, that of dilemma, that of strictness, that of the Puritan view, and that of a more modern cosmopolitan view that brings about various understandings of the treatment of adultery. Secondly, if you're familiar with any kind of literary history, you would know that it is unprecedented in its approach, and it is extremely difficult to imitate. And among its most important features are the development of characters who are partly realistic and partly stylized, and whose inner states of mind are considered far more important than their outer actions. A lot of emphasis is given on the inner turmoil, on the inner dilemma, the guilt that the characters feel through. So rather than placing a lot of importance on the actions and the plot of the novel, Hawthorne draws our attention to the inner dilemma, turmoil, and guilt of each character, which reflects more about their characterization, about their persona, than the actions that they take place. For example, Dimmesdale, who on the outward of it may seem like a man who was coward, a man who was scared enough to take responsibility, but his inner dilemma, his inner turmoil, and his suffering tells us that you cannot categorize this character in terms of black and white. There are a lot of shades, there are multi-folds of layers and meanings to his existence. And to a certain extent, the social scenario, the social context of his time justifies his behavior. So it becomes difficult for the reader to then clearly categorize Dimmesdale as either a good character or a bad character. And that, I think, is the genius of the author in the way he puts emphasis to his characters. And then, not only the elaborate yet quiet style, but configuration of setting, situation, characters, and the concerns in the Scarlet letter are characteristic of this author and no other. Yet individual elements can be extracted from the mixture, and when we see them in other writers, we call them Hawthornian in its nature. In transcending genres, Hawthorne invented his own genre. The second aspect that makes the novel a classic is its intellectual and emotional impact on the readers. The emotional impact of the novel rises from our engagement with the situation of the major characters, our appreciation of their dilemmas, and our reluctant acceptance to their destinies. In the interweaving of choice and fatality, Hawthorne's narrative approaches tragedy. The intellectual impact arises from the difficulty of assigning clear praise or blame to anyone, and the consequent necessity of working our way through the myriad implications and the ramifications of the situation of each character taken separately, and the situation that of all of them make together. This is why the book achieves so much depth with so small a cast of characters and with such limited events that happens in the plot of the story. Because a lot of emphasis derives from within rather than from the outside. For hundreds of thousands of readers since 1850, when the text was first published, the four important characters in the Scarlet Letter, that is Hester Prynne, Arthur Dimmesdale, Roger Chillingworth, and Pearl, have become part of their mental landscape. If the reader hear of an obsessively vengeful man, they think of Chillingworth. A beautiful but wild child will remind them of Pearl. Reading about a respected member of the community exposed for a secret sin, they will think of Dimmesdale. And finding themselves in conflict with authority, scorned by public opinion for doing what they believe to be right, they will identify themselves, whether they are men or women, with Hester Prynne. So the characters in themselves stands for universality. Their actions, their dilemmas have stood the test of time. They stand for each major emotions that each one of us goes through, whether it is vengeance, whether it is jealousy, whether it is standing for what we think is correct, or of being a man of high status in the society being exposed for his sin, something that is still relevant in the modern society. And as for the symbol of the Scarlet Letter itself, it has achieved a kind of status as shorthand for any negative labeling imposed on an individual by his or her surroundings. A work that makes this kind of impact on our self-understanding cannot be anything but important. Even before that, you have to ask the question, what is Hester Prynne's crime? Now, the novel begins not with an adulterous attraction or discovery of the affair, but with the consequence of adultery, with Hester Prynne's emergence from her prison cell to endure her exposure on the pillory, and with glimpses of the other central characters' private misery, which the novel explores in great depth in the subsequent chapters. The judgments of the Puritan society that brands Hester with the Scarlet A subjects her to an official sentence of public humiliation and ostracizes her and her child are apt to seem disproportionate to the crime. Yet Hawthorne's novel remains credible both as a reflection on a particular historical moment and as a portrait of the internal devastation caused by a particular transgression that, in the America at least, might today inspire an ambivalent mixture of censure, titillation, and indifference. So the question is, what did Hester Prynne do? The novel opens with Hester emerging from the prison to carry out her sentence. A panel of magistrates, in their great mercy and tenderness of heart, spares Hester the statutory punishment of death and sentences her instead to stand only a space of 3 hours on the platform of the pillory, and then and therefore for the remainder of her natural life to wear a mark of shame on her bosom. The mark of shame is the letter A, made from the scarlet cloth and fantastically embroidered by Hester. During her exposure, one of the patriarchs who have gathered to oversee Hester's punishment demands that she reveal the father of the child she clutches to her breast. Hester refuses, and when the patriarchs urge the respected minister Arthur Dimmesdale to entreat her, she meets his eye and vows never to reveal the identity of her lover. So at this point of time, we realize that Hester was in an affair with Arthur Dimmesdale, and as a result of the affair, and as a result of the love, I should rather say, Hester was pregnant and had a child, Pearl. Now, since the society was so embedded in the Puritan belief system, they considered the affair to be an adultery, a sin that they had committed, which needs to be truly punished. And what was the punishment? They didn't want to be harsh on her, but rather they wanted to stay true to their Puritan sentiments of bringing the society, of correcting the society through public humiliation. And hence Hester is asked to stand on the pillory every day of her life for 3 hours so that people can learn from her shame, people can learn from her remorse, and people can learn from the disrespect that she gains in the society, not to commit the kind of sin that she has created. And the tension between Pearl and Arthur Dimmesdale tells us that the love affair or the affair is still not over. Even though it has been 7 years, both these characters have been suffering from within. Arthur Dimmesdale continuing his inner suffering with guilt, dilemma, moral implications is also represented in terms of the physical pain that he goes through, and Hester's dilemma can continuously be seen through her actions. But even though the novel gives you a hint of what Hester Prynne's crime was, it never really openly characterizes it as adultery. Hawthorne never uses the term adultery for the love affair. He leaves his ideas ambivalent. He leaves it to the reader's interpretation. What we know is that Hester has been spending her time in the prison. And for Hester, the meeting is a release of the passion she has continued to feel for Dimmesdale since the time of their affair. Hester is desperate in the scene to assuage her former lover's misery, not only out of concern for his well-being, but also because she wants him to accept her and her child into his life. She says to their affair, "What we did had a consecration of its own," an apparent reference to Pearl that borrows religious term to describe what Dimmesdale views as an offense against his faith. And to this, Dimmesdale's response is far more equivocal. He initially chastises Hester for having caused him to stray, then blames Chillingworth for his miserable emotional state. Lastly, when he lacks the courage to propose the plan himself, he enunciates his desires to Hester, then passively accedes when she at last expresses the same desire, one that she kept hidden for 7 years, that she, Dimmesdale, and Pearl leave Boston to live together as a family. And although the mark of Hester's crime is stitched in red across her breast, embellished in stigma across the breast of her lover, and broadcast across the sky, Hawthorne never names her crime in the Scarlet Letter. The novel's title alludes to, but does not reveal, the letter A, which itself suggests, but does not divulge, the crime of adultery. By the time Roger Chillingworth, concealingly his relationship to Hester when he wanders into the crowd during her exposure, inquires of a spectre, "Wherefore is she here, set up to public shame?" the two symbols of Hester's crime, the Scarlet Letter and the baby Pearl, have all but revealed its nature. Before we move further, I would give you a little introduction to who Hester Prynne was and where she came from. Hester Prynne was married to Roger Chillingworth when they were staying in England. She was a new bride and it was a loveless marriage. Although the reasons are not clearly given in the novel why Hester married Roger Chillingworth, but it has been mentioned that she came from a poor family, and it makes obvious sense that why she would marry an old man who had no feelings for her, and vice versa. So in England, Roger Chillingworth decides that they will leave the place and start a new life in the new land. He sends his new bride ahead of him, and Hester lands in America. She waits for Roger Chillingworth for around a year, and there is no sign of him. It is then that the new bride thinks that he may have died or some mishappening must have occurred to him on the sea. And then she falls in love with Arthur Dimmesdale, and there is a consecration of their love. Little did she know that Roger Chillingworth would come back many years later into the same town when she will be punished for her crime. Roger Chillingworth requests Hester Prynne not to reveal that she was married to him, because then he will be going through the public humiliation of being a cuckold, of being a man who was cheated by his wife. So she conceals the name of her husband, and she also conceals the name of the father of the child, because she does not want to play around with the reputation of Arthur Dimmesdale. Now, if that is the emotion that Hester Prynne is going through, can we really call this adultery? That is the question, that is the first question that comes to our mind. And to this question, D.H. Lawrence, who is a renowned author, assumed that Hester seduced Dimmesdale, an explanation that renders the act of adultery more plausible, but not any easier to imagine, depriving his readers of the means of imagining the event that triggers Dimmesdale's unraveling. Chillingworth's vendetta, Pearl's birth, and Hester's disgrace seems to be a deliberate part of Hawthorne's artistic design. The crime that gives the novel its name and preoccupies all the characters then is shrouded as much by the symbolism that overshadows the thing symbolized as by the shame of the characters. Without an account of the criminal act, readers of the Scarlet Letter apprehend Hester's crime through the refracted light of multiple moral perspectives. The narrator and the Puritan community both overtly pass judgment on Hester's act. Although the former vacillates in the harshness with which he judges her, in addition, each of the three important adult characters, that is Arthur Dimmesdale, Roger Chillingworth, and Hester Prynne, present a particular response to Hester's adultery that may inform our own. The fourth important character, that is Pearl, although a child and only intuitively aware of the crime, offers an additional perspective as well as a real challenge to a response of unmediated censure. For if the Puritans cannot qualify their judgment of Hester's crime, they cannot acknowledge what Hester calls its consecration. Now that we have understood what was Hester Prynne's crime, what was her relationship to Roger Chillingworth and Arthur Dimmesdale, and a little bit of light has been thrown on their moral dilemmas, it is important then to associate Hester Prynne's crime to the Puritan society and look at the perspectives on Hester's crime. What was Hawthorne's position as an author on the crime that she committed? Was he saying that she committed adultery, or was he ambivalent in his approach towards Hester's crime? Now, all throughout the novel, Hawthorne's ambivalence towards his Puritan ancestry complicates the attempts to understand his response to Hester Prynne, her act of adultery, and the punishment inflicted on her. In the novel's introductory section, The Custom House, Hawthorne refers to the stern and black, broad Puritans who were his forebearers. He says that these men were magistrates, and the records of early Massachusetts history with which Hawthorne was acquainted contain accounts of each of these men inflicting humiliating and often brutal sentences. The elder magistrate Hawthorne, for example, sentenced a burglar to having his ear lopped off and the letter B branded onto his forehead. Such was the society that we're talking about. But the notoriety of Hawthorne's forebearers derives primarily from their treatment of women. In their roles as magistrates and Puritan patriarchs, the Hawthornes had no squeamishness about inflicting physical punishments on women for their religion, sexual behavior, and most infamously supposed practice of witchcraft. The reference in the Custom House to the incident of William Hawthorne's hard severity towards a woman relates to the treatment of a Quaker woman who was tied half naked to the back of a cart and flogged 10 times, each in Boston, Salem, and Dedham, at the Honorable William Hawthorne's description. The records of the Salem Quarterly Courts of Essex County in Massachusetts reveals a sentence issued by William Hawthorne against an erring woman in November of 1668. Hester Crawford, for fornication, as she confessed, was ordered to be severely whipped, and that security to be given to save the town from the charge of keeping the child. The judgment of her being whipped was respite for a month or 6 months after the birth of her child, and it was left to the worshipful Major William Hawthorne to see it executed on a lecture day. That also explains the name of the major character of Hester Prynne. And now this passage, I think, which is part of their actual history, likely influenced Hawthorne's choice of the name of his heroine in the Scarlet Letter. William Hawthorne's fifth son, John, added to the notoriety of the family name in his role examining many of those accused of being witches during the Salem witchcraft trials of 1692, a role he never repented even when other magistrates who served on the same panel expressed their remorse. Most of those accused and executed as witches were women. Hawthorne describes his feelings about his Hawthorne ancestors with a mix of horror, awe, and kingship, asking that he not be cursed for their deeds, at the same time imagining their disdain for their descendant and noting that strong traits of their nature have intertwined themselves with mine. Critics generally take the Hawthorne's addition to a W to his ancestral name as an evidence of a desire to distance himself from his ancestors. Possibly, though, Hawthorne sought to spare the Hawthornes the association with his literary career, which characterized in the Custom House as a source of ignominy. In describing the Boston governor and the assemblage of elders who preside over the exposure of the Scarlet Letter, the narrator vacillates between qualified praise and open dissent. Governor Bellingham was not ill-fitted to be the head and representative of a community which owed its origin and progress and its present state of development not to the impulses of youth but to the stern and tempered energies of manhood and the somber sagacity of age, accomplishing so much precisely because it imagined and hoped so little. The other eminent characters by whom the chief ruler was surrounded were distinguished by a dignity of mien belonging to a period when the forms of authority were felt to possess the sacredness of divine institution. They were doubtless good men, just and sage, says the author. So these quotes from the text tells us that Hawthorne had quite an ambivalent position towards Hester Prynne's crime. Although he wasn't ashamed of his Puritan heritage, of being associated to that Puritan heritage can easily be seen in Hester Prynne's punishment and the crime that she commits. Although having a Puritan lineage, Hawthorne does not solely subscribe himself to the punishment that was given to Hester. Rather, he links the name of his heroine and the punishment that was given to her to the actual historical records that took place in Salem and Boston. So throughout the novel, we would see that Hawthorne takes an ambivalent position about the Puritans' attitude in the society, the punishment that was given to Hester Prynne, and the actual crime that she commits. I think at the end of the novel, he actually leaves it also onto the reader, that we will cover this part in the reader response theory of the text, that how the reader wants to take up the crime and the punishment that was given to Hester. Do we have a rational view of her crime? Do we have irrational view about her crime? Or do the reader takes a more moderate, ambivalent position, just like Hawthorne does?